So, Carly, in that movement number 3, McKinnon's Brook Suite, the Long March, we see my ancestor Hugh McKinnon making the journey across Cape Breton Island in late winter to file a petition for his family's land at McKinnon's Brook. It was a journey well known in our family lore that ended in tragedy. Can you tell us about that process of petitioning and then the granting of land? Because these are two different things, right?
Yeah, there were two sections, two phases to the process. So when people arrived and they had an idea of the land that they wanted to acquire, so usually they might be near family members or people that they knew from Scotland or people of the same religion, they would make a petition, and that petition was basically a request for maybe 100 or 200 or 500 acres of land, and they would be very clear on where they wanted the land to be and the dimensions, and that petition would be forwarded to the Lieutenant Governor, and then there would be surveyors to make sure that everything was in order and that there was nobody else who had a claim to that land.
Right.
And you'll see sometimes in the petition they're saying, well, so-and-so had it, but he hasn't used it, and so there's all of that, so they had to clear that. And once that petition was approved, then they could go forward with they would get a grant for that land, which was actually a legal document that was signed and sealed and basically saying you are now the owner of this. But usually there was a requirement that they had to clear so many acres in the first 3 years or something, and there were regulations that they had to follow, but it was a process. Yeah.
Okay. So I presume then that the settlers that were the first to arrive in northern Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, had the pick of the best land. Is that the case?
It is the case.
Yeah.
It's exactly what they did.
And what did that really good land look like?
It was land that was often the fertile farmland. I mean, it's all trees, right? So they were looking at, where are the rivers running? What is the proximity to the ocean or to a little harbor that they could use to export their goods, where merchants were going to be setting up? And usually it's along the coasts, or a lot of people were petitioning for land around the Brador Lakes, again, because there are no roads in Cape Breton at this time. There might be paths, but the easiest way to move your products and to get things in and out is by water. So you're going to go around really rich, fertile water sources that have good land off of them. That's what they're looking for, and that goes first, and it gets snapped up. Right,
okay. So our people were on the earlier side of settlement on the island of Cape Breton. Later on, though, through the 1840s and 50s, there were still Highland settlers arriving.
Yeah.
Now, some of these people, as I understand from you, many of them, ended up squatting on land. What did that look like?
Well, over half of Cape Breton's population were squatters into the 1850s, and so that's a big deal, and that's something else that as a province we need to look at, and what is the legacy of that. But people did not want, when they're arriving from Scotland in the 1840s and 1850s, that's kind of the last bunch of people that are being cleared, so they're coming over in really destitute situations. And they don't have money, so they can't actually pay for a land grant. But they also have no desire to live under the authority of another landlord because of the trauma that they'd experienced in Scotland. And so they just decide to set themselves up wherever they can. And you get a lot of people just having little communities around the island with no clear title to the land, but they're going to settle there and nobody's going to move them. And in fact, you have a lot of tension as well between the squatters and the Mi'kmaq because they don't care. They are just going to settle where they want to. Yeah.
Now, would these people eventually have applied for title to the land that they would have been squatting on for, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, they did. And so I've done a little bit of work on a settlement site in northern Cape Breton called Pollett's Cove.
Oh, yes.
And yes.
Great hiking.
Great hiking, exhausting.
It's a challenging hike in there, yes.
Yeah,
My daughter did it last summer.
Oh, I almost killed myself doing it. But with that settlement, it was a squatter settlement at first.
Yeah.
And so what we've seen is the father of, he had, I think, two sons, I believe. It wasn't him that petitioned for formal land, for the land grant. It was his sons. And that happened, I think they moved in the late 1830s, and then the late 1850s or early 1860s, that's when the boys petition and get legal title to the land.
I see.
And so it does roll over, but it takes a little bit of time.
Right.
And there were incentives. The government wanted them all on the books. And so
Okay.
they start saying, well, we'll forgive you for being squatters, but can we make this all legal?
Right. Gotcha. Now, I want to talk about religion. Because it was and continues to be, a huge part of the lives of Highlanders in Cape Breton. Mary McKinnon,
Yeah.
my ancestor, after losing her husband, you see at the very tail end of the movement, she's at her husband's grave and makes a sign of the cross. It's our subtle hint that our people were Roman Catholic, as were the vast majority, if not all, of the Barra people that came from the Isle of Barra in Scotland. Can you tell us about the role of religious faith for these people?
Yeah, I'm like
It's a
this.
big one.
This is a gigantic topic, and it's actually my research area. So, Barra was primarily a Catholic island in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. The interesting thing about Cape Breton is we can actually see on the people who petitioned for land, in order to get land, they had to first swear an oath of allegiance if they were Catholic.
Right.
So we get a sense of who was Catholic in terms of the land petitioners. But there was a lot of religious tension in Scotland at this time. There was very significant animosity between Catholics and Protestants, Presbyterians in Scotland. But when they come to Cape Breton, the really interesting thing is, for the first time, Catholics in many places are actually a majority population. And this is fascinating when you look at it from an imperial history perspective, because the British state, the British Empire, is often portrayed as a Protestant entity. But when you look at places like Prince Edward Island, parts of Newfoundland, Cape Breton, parts of Nova Scotia, parts of New Brunswick, there are significant Catholic settlements that happen that enabled the British government to extend its authority. And therefore, there's a very interesting relationship between Catholicism and British imperialism that we haven't really looked at before. We're starting to. But if you take Cape Breton and the people from Barra, they are part of that movement, and they are part of that expansion of Catholicism throughout the British Empire. It's fascinating and it's really important, and it's something that we need to pay a little bit more attention to. Because of this idea that the British Empire was Protestant. And you think, well, okay, but what about all the Catholics? Not to mention all of the colonies that Britain acquired that had majority Catholic, French, or enslaved populations. And so this is part of a much bigger story of empire building. I just quite like using Cape Breton as an example because well, I'm here and we have these populations at our doorstep, but it also shows that the imperial program there were many more constituents than people often assume, and your people were part of that. So I think it's fascinating as a researcher. That's what I'm super interested in.
And the dynamics between the Catholic and Presbyterian populations in Scotland, when our people left, they weren't the best of relationships. There were tensions between the two groups, a lot of suspicion, but a lot of those the tension and suspicion, as I understand it, evaporated. Maybe not all, but a lot of it did on arriving here in Cape Breton, because we had not only the Catholics, but a lot of Presbyterians that were among the Highlanders that settled.
I'm not sure
Keep
it's okay to say evaporated, but
Okay.
changed,
Right.
You still have settlements that are largely Presbyterian, largely Catholic, but they are interacting and they're living pretty closely together. And the fact that they are in a space that they are becoming familiar with and that they are building up their farms and their communities and whatever, they did need to rely on neighbors more than they had to in Scotland. And so this changes. And I've done some work on Upper Canada, and there's a lot of discussion. The Quebec priests, for example, get really frustrated with the Scottish priests because they're too close to the Scottish Presbyterians. Yeah. And they wish they weren't friends,
Okay.
right? And so the dynamic changes when they come over here.
Yeah.
There were still tensions, but nothing like
Yeah.
what it was in Scotland.
Okay. Well, let's leave religion.
Okay.
Maybe we'll get a chance to cover politics. We've covered religion so far.
Okay.
But let's move on to movement number 4, which is the Kehoe movement, MacKinnon's Brook Suite.